there is a Davos disconnect which largely goes ignored here in 2013. Sitting here in the most powerful people's gathering in the world, people are talking about a global economic recovery, but they're not talking about over 200 million jobs or unemployed people out there. To give me that perspective, Guy Ryder, Director General at the International Labour Organization, great to have you here on NDTV, Mr. Ryder. That's my first question, the Davos disconnect. You have a recovery, or everyone cheering about a recovery, but then you have the reality, which is this huge figure of unemployed people.
I think you're absolutely right to point to this disconnect, because you're right. I think that the talk in Davos this year is that we've turned the corner, that the financial problems are beginning to come under control, that we're setting the foundations for renewed growth and confidence. And yet, as you're pointing out, our figures show that global unemployment went up in 2012. There were over 4 million more people added to the unemployment queues. And the worrying thing is looking forwards to next year, well, it's another 5 million and another 3 million after that. So I think policymakers and business people need to think, well, hold on a minute, where are the realities of this recovery? And what are the people who actually don't make it to Davos feeling about the state of the world economy? And I hope they reflect on that. And I hope as a result that we put the jobs crisis, because we have a jobs crisis, at the center of the discussion.
Well, you know, I'm going to talk about a question which is usually spoken in the stock markets versus economy context. People say, do stock markets lead the economies, or do economies lead the markets? And here the question is, do jobs follow economic recoveries, or does economic recovery really lead to jobs? So that's really the dilemma.
Sure. Well, I think one thing is shown by history, that when you have the type of recession induced by financial collapse, financial crisis that we've had since 2007, it normally takes an awfully long time for the job market, the real economy, to recover. And I think what policymakers need to think is how to shorten that time lag, as it were. By the way, we're making a big assumption here. Our big assumption is we fixed the financial economy. I very much hope that is the case, but we've seen some false dawns before. Let's hope we've got it right this time.
I'll come to India in just a moment, but in the US, the big conversation has been the number of unemployed people and the fact that Ben Bernanke has done everything, QE3 and what have you, to try and get that number up. And he's a really frustrated man. So it doesn't seem that there is an answer in terms of what a central bank governor can do and what the government can do.
Well, you're right. Monetarily speaking, I think Mr. Bernanke's thrown everything at the jobs crisis and has indicated he will continue to do that. Now, what are we seeing in the US? We're seeing some improvement in growth and some reduction in unemployment, but it's still awfully high, particularly by US standards. I mean, the headline figure is just under 8% now, 7.8, but you know, if you add in a lot of American citizens who've simply withdrawn from the labour market, they've given up.
Right.
The situation is actually much worse.
Right.
Now, can anything then be done? Well, you've got the whole debate about the fiscal cliff and the fiscal debt ceilings coming into play there. But I think the United States as well, and this is part of the global story, needs a more conducive international environment. Part of the US lesson, and I would say it's true in Europe as well, is individual countries are not going to climb out of this mess all by themselves. Whether we like it, our destinies are linked together. So what happens in India, what happens in the United States, what happens here in Europe, are part of a bigger story. And it really is needful that internationally governments sit together and basically get their music to be in tune with each other.
Absolutely. Jobs are in a flat world now, and you can't afford to be insular. But really coming to India,
yes.
The unemployment rate is even harder to gauge than the United States,
right,
because we don't really have a number. At least US can talk about a 7.8%. You might contest whether it's reliable or not with people withdrawing from the labour force. But for India, there's so much hidden unemployment, youth unemployment, people who are, you know, just not paid for their services. So how would you reckon that India fares in the general unemployment and the jobs picture?
Yeah, I think the point that you make is absolutely valid. Just to talk of formal open unemployment in India is perhaps to give a misleading picture of the real situation. In a country where you have the unstructured part of the economy, the informal part of the economy, overwhelmingly the one where most people work, I think problems of underemployment, unpaid and vulnerable employment are the big story. Now, so how do we approach what's happening in India? I think the first thing to say is we look at the growth rates, and India, which does very well compared to European standards, you had a bit of a dip last year. You were just under the 5% mark. We hope it's coming back a bit, and India certainly needs that growth. But I think also India needs to look at the type of jobs that it's creating, the direction of its economic growth. And there I think we can uncover some more specific issues. There are some very vulnerable people in labour markets in India. There are some problems which I'm very optimistic that the Indian government wants to address, of those who are in great difficulty. And then, of course, we have to see how that industrial manufacturing sector plays a critical role, the IT sector. It's a difficult and complex equation for India, but a very important one for the global economy.
A short while back, I interviewed Alan Greenspan, and he said the one thing that's holding India back are labor reforms. He talked about this, and now you have World Bank, you have IMF all saying, listen, the labor reforms are pathetic in India because they encourage people to hire workers who are not in the structured organized labor force. In fact, I was reading numbers and it said 32% of them came in from the unstructured labor force in 2000, and that's gone up to 68% in 2010. How would you look at labor reforms in India and really press for some drastic action?
Well, it's an interesting diagnosis of the problem in India. Of course, some of the labour legislation in India goes way back to 1947 and even before 1947. So obviously the world has changed enormously since then. But I actually think that the major problem with labour legislation in India is not so much that it's inappropriate and crowding people out of the formal economy. I think your major problem is one of enforcement. When we go to India, when we look at Indian legislation, and certainly there are things that need to be done with Indian legislation, one of the biggest problems I see is enforcement capacities. What's written on paper in the legislation, what happens in workplaces, often do not bear as much resemblance to each other as one would want. So yes, the reform process is important. Labour legislation has to accompany that reform process, and of course we watch the major political debates in India that surround those issues. But India needs also to pay great attention to the administration of that legislation to make sure it doesn't remain a dead letter, but it actually lives in a country which I do not underestimate the complexities of in terms of the size and the variety of situations to be addressed.
But the inevitable comparison between China and India always comes up by businesses who want to do business in these countries, and they say the one decision that really made it clear for them was the fact that labor reforms are easier, or labor laws are easier in China, despite it being state-controlled and a unilateral form of government. But it's just easier to hire workers, fire workers, just run companies.
Yeah, and I think that's right, except that it doesn't actually have to do with the nature of the law itself. It's very much to do with the environment. In China, well, you have infrastructure, you have reliability in several areas. It's true. Investors look for reliability, predictability. But I think that if India is going to look at China and draw some conclusions from it, it's very much more in terms of the infrastructure offered to business, the reliability both in terms of infrastructure, but also the soft skills issues. India's got enormous advantages as well. The English language capacity in your country gives tremendous advantages. I do not believe that India needs to completely or continually look over its shoulder at China to find the right solutions. There are advantages, there are disadvantages on both sides. India will certainly find its own way.
And human capital and labor force is such a complex and complicated story, but thanks for giving us some of that real insight, a deeper issue in the Davos propaganda and the general feelings of so many different stories about the economic recovery. Thank you very much, Guy Ryder.
Thank you.
India's #1 news app just got even better. Download NDTV's new app. Fully optimized for Retina display. Full screen view. Faster response time. And Sudoku. NDTV's new iPad app. Download now.